initially I didn't have a title for this, and I didn't want a title because I wanted to jump in straight with questions. But I've titled it Eli Toy Clocks and the Transition from Craft Production to Industrial Manufacturing. And of course, as you know, the basic premise of the project is you choose an object from the 18th century, and then you have to explain the history of it, you have to explain the story of it, you have to explain the narrative of it. And this is my object. It's currently on view at the Wadsworth Athenaeum. It's an Eli Terry clock by a man named Eli Terry, an American clockmaker from Connecticut in 1792. And as we'll see, you should know that prior to all of this, clocks for the longest time were a luxury item. And actually, I'll talk a little bit about the clock, but I wanted to say that like the reason why I'm doing this presentation is, well, there's a couple of things. So it's like, in life, there's two biggest luxuries that you can have. One is time, and the second is the space to improve yourself and get a second chance. And most people don't have a lot of time at all. And most people don't get second chances or don't have the opportunity to improve or have second chances. Today I have both. I have your time that you've given me, and this will take, if I do this well, it should take nearly 55 minutes for the entire lecture, including stopping for questions. And secondly, I get the space to improve, because hopefully you didn't notice, but in the presentation that I gave during class, 3 weeks ago, I guess, I made a couple of mistakes. Hopefully you didn't notice, but this is a second chance for me, and it's an opportunity for me to improve. Okay, so yeah, back to the clock. So the reason why I chose this clock is because, and of course, this is something that you won't know just by looking at it, but this clock is a perfect representation of the transition between an economy based on craft production, things made by hand, and capitalist production, things made by industry and private enterprise, made and traded, bought and sold, made and traded. And that's, hopefully you'll completely understand that by the end of this lecture. Okay, well, one thing is though, I noticed that, I recognize that a lot of people aren't used to thinking, even myself included, are not used to thinking about big ideas like capital, or big economic ideas like capitalism and class. And it's very hard to just jump in and start. So I have a series of questions just to jog our brains and get ourselves going. The first question is, where, geographically speaking, do you think of when you think of the word industry? So where in the US, where in the world, geographically speaking, when you hear the word? Yep.
I think just in the context of this class,
Yeah.
Industry, I think of like London or England, the Industrial Revolution. In terms of industry in the 21st century, and capitalism, I think it would be US and China.
Yeah, that's a really good answer. Anyone else? Where, when you hear the word, like not even just related to this class, but just when you literally hear the word, what do you think of? Where? What do you think of? Any answer? Okay,
Do you want-
yeah.
I'll jump in here.
Yeah.
So I think of, so in the 18th century, of course, I think of England, I think of, the area around Birmingham, these sort of mining towns and things like that. And then I think of, in the British colonies, I think of basically New England, from, Massachusetts through Rhode Island and down into Connecticut. And particularly what we're looking at are places that, need to be on a waterway so that things can move back and forth. And then, later on, as we think about industry, like say in the 19th century, where, when the term titans of industry comes into vogue, and we're seeing this continual movement west in the United States to kind of find other sources of raw materials. So, but yeah, I guess probably New England. New England is where the Industrial Revolution started in the United States.
Yeah, that's a very advanced answer.
Thank you.
Yeah, so basically the main answers are England, which is kind of true. The Industrial Revolution too basically started in England to a large extent. But the thing, and I won't have time to explain this now, or even in my entire presentation, but one of the things that I'm working against is the idea that the Industrial Revolution in America is simply a product of the Industrial Revolution in Britain being exported to America, which is part of the reason why so many people focus on the Slater mills in Providence and in the Merrimack River Valley, because Samuel Slater is a protege of Richard Arkwright, and well, he's actually British himself, and he comes from Britain, and he sets up these mills that are based off the English system. But I don't have time to talk about that. And yeah, of course, in the 21st century, I think of the Rust Belt, and I think of the eastern seaboard of China. Okay. The next question is, and if you notice, the level of abstraction in the questions are getting progressively higher. So the second question is, how does society change when things go from being produced by hand to being produced by machines?
That's a very big question.
Yeah, if you don't have we actually aren't going to answer any of these questions, but the object is to get you to think about why they're important.
I guess in general, we just place less value in everyday things that we own.
Yeah, things become commodified. Yeah, that's a good answer. Okay. We can skip that.
The alienation of labor.
Yeah, that too.
Yeah, the producer becomes distanced from the product.
Right. And the user becomes distant from the producer.
Yeah. And you have things like commodity fetish. Yeah. Okay, so the last question at the very highest level of abstraction is, at what point in a country's development can it be called capitalist? So it's like saying, at what point in a person's life can they be called an adult? Or could they be called a child, or could they be called elderly? At what point is a country capitalist? Any thoughts? I mean, this is a huge question. I'm not going to answer this question, but any answers? Any ideas? So long as you're thinking about it, that's what I'm trying to get. And also, if you have any questions, I'm going to try to stop at points, probably because I don't have a very good voice. My throat hurts, like after a long time. So I'm going to have to stop for questions, just so that, I don't cry out of pain. Okay, so these are 5 of the larger ideas that we're going to touch on. And of course, we're mostly just going to be looking at clocks and stuff. But, so the 5 ideas are: 1, the transition to capitalism from a pre-modern economy, which is actually kind of a part of the second point, which is the origins of industrial manufacturing. And we're going to talk about the transition from when things are made by artisans and artisan production to when things are made in factories with capital-intensive machinery. And then third, we're going to talk about the emergence of capitalist class relations. So how class is affected by changes in production. And then fourth, this is the one that we're going to talk about least, just because it's this version of the presentation, I kind of had to cut a lot of this out. But we're going to talk about state-led development. And I'm drawing on a lot of which was actually written to try to understand the East Asian countries' development, which was very much state-led and very clearly state, for a lot of people at least, very clearly state-led. In China you have the CCP, a state organization that's leading development. In Japan you have MITI, an organization, another government organization with development. In Korea you have the Economic Planning Board, And you literally have in the most important period of Korea's economic development, a dictatorship, and it's, what's called, stable development. But in the United States, you have a similar thing. Despite what a lot of neoclassical economists say, industry couldn't take off, capitalism couldn't take off without the state, the state actually leading in many cases the first factories. And then fifth is actually the importance of the Connecticut River Valley area, which is kind of relating back to what I said. It's not so much Massachusetts or Rhode Island, it's actually Connecticut and Western Massachusetts. Okay, so just to give a very quick overview, America in the 18th century and the early Republic period is mostly agrarian. So on the top, that's actually a bad photo, but it's a photo of a slave plantation, an indigo plantation. So slaves, of course, are nearly exclusively in rural agrarian production. And on the bottom, these are kind of caricature, symbolic pictures of the yeoman farmer. And especially in the north, there's a lot of independent small farmers. I think it's important also to point out that if we're talking about British North America, there's also, by the 18th century, there's still a whole lot of indigenous people. Like the population is, I can't give you numbers off the dome, but it's pretty high. But who are the people with money? Who are the people with capital? Because that's going to be important to our story. And that's what you see on the left. This was actually, see, I put it in the slides before we did the reading, but this is actually in the Copley reading that we did. And this is of a merchant. And in early America, there's a lot of trade and commerce going on. And really, if you think about it, trading companies are the first capitalist entities in the world. And as a result of, really to begin the story of capitalism, you have to start with commercial capital being circulated. And in the US, there was a lot of money and capital being concentrated in the hands of very rich merchants. So yeah, mostly agrarian society, slaves, indentured servants, lots of farmers, especially. And then the people with money and capital are merchants. But the other, and who are mostly based in cities. But the other, or port towns, but the other probably most important class of people in the port towns are artisans. And a clockmaker is an artisan of sorts, right? So with artisans, there are basically 3 tiers, you could say, of different levels of trades. At the very bottom, you have people like dock workers and sailors, and that's what you see on the left. That's Crispus Attucks, one of the victims of the Boston Massacre. He was a dock worker of African and indigenous descent. Not unlike Frederick Douglass, I just thought about that. Right, so sailors and dock workers were at the bottom. And then at the middle, you have someone like Pat Lyon, which is what you see on the right. He was a blacksmith. So blacksmiths, maybe tailors, that's kind of in the middle level, maybe maybe like woodworkers as well at the middle level. Then at the very top level, you have people like silversmiths, and actually clockmakers would be at the top as well. So someone like Paul Revere, for instance, would be at the very top. So definitely an artisan, definitely part of the so-called urban liberated classes, but very much at the upper echelons of that. And then, of course, within trades, you have master craftsmen who are at the very top of individual trades. They might own their own shop. They might employ their own workers or other artisans. They might even own a few slaves, although slavery declines kind of rapidly in the north, at least, after the aftermath of the American Revolution. Then journeymen are basically artisans who are selling their labor for compensation by master craftsmen. And then apprentices, which are at the very lowest, are actually more often than not children who go to live with master craftsmen for a period of time so as to learn the skills of the trade. So if you look at the Pat Lyon portrait, you'll see the child in the back. That's one of Patlin's apprentices. I don't know knows his name, but actually the apprentice system was in some ways part of, well, it was like an early system of education prior to public education. Right, and we'll see that Eli Terry and other clockmakers apprenticed with people and became journeymen and then became master craftsmen themselves. Okay. Then this is basically the last kind of like topical slide before we get to Eli Terry himself. So it's very important to understand that Eli Terry is living in the aftermath of the American Revolution, which is a huge, important historical event. And there's three like broad things that I want to say about the American Revolution. The first is that the American Revolution is basically the first time, and at least the Western world, arguably any time, when for the artisans and common people, as well as people like small farmers, become politically important. So previously, it was really only rich professionals like lawyers and the elite, nobility even, who are involved in politics. And that changes with the American Revolution because for the first time, you get things like independent organizations of artisans. You get things like artisans voicing their opinions in the popular press, in print media. Actually the most popular book in the 18th century, in the American Revolutionary era, is by Thomas Paine, Common Sense. And Thomas Paine is a former corset maker. He's an artisan himself, or was an artisan from England. Okay, the second big thing is that in the aftermath of the American Revolution, the British North American colonies go from being exactly that, colonies of Britain, under which trade is very heavily regulated, to an independent country that's seeking to have free trade with other countries. So you go from trade being restricted to a new country that's seeking out free trade. And then the last thing about the American Revolution is it creates a federal state. So prior to the American Revolution, there was local government, and then there was the crown and parliament. And now we have a federal state. And the federal state is able to do things like enforce property relations. It's able to enforce federal, create and oversee federal contracts to independent producers. It's able to have a patent system to protect inventions from producers. And it's able to do things like enforce tariffs and trade policy. And all of those things are very important for the rise of capitalism. Okay, now we can finally get to Terry. And as you can see, just look at the years that he's living. He's living right in the aftermath of the American Revolution. He's coming of age and he's apprenticed, actually, like literally right when the federal government is broke, when it begins. Okay. So Eli Terry was born in what is today South Windsor, what was then Windsor or East Windsor. And he was actually a fairly orthodox clockmaker. There wasn't like anything extremely stand out about him. However, there are a couple things that are really noteworthy. One is that he was apprenticed by Daniel Burnap, and he received training from people, a family of artisans in what is today Manchester, Connecticut, called the Cheney's. And that's important for a few reasons. So Daniel Burnap is important because he's one of the first people to make clocks in advance of sales. So he starts to make clocks more than once at a time, whereas previously, clocks were basically made to order because it was such a luxury item that you'd have rich people going, upper class people going to clockmakers, requesting clock movements for a lot of money, and they buy the clock movement, then they have to pay for a case themselves. And this is very much a luxury item. And Burnap starts to make clocks in advance of sales. And I think this is, we'll never know because the records are so scant and there's a dearth of manuscripts from artisans, but it's probably because of the fact that there's increasing market relations and he's being forced to make more clocks. Similarly, with the Cheney's, who Eli Terry also received training from, the Cheney's made their clock movements out of wood, which is in many cases cheaper and quicker to assemble, which will become important later on. Also another thing to point out is that clockmakers are mostly responsible for the wooden movements inside the clock. Sorry, not the wooden movement, the movements. Usually they're made by either brass or wood, mostly brass actually. And so the clockmaker was responsible for the machinery inside to make the clock run. And especially when clockmaking was still a luxury market, the buyer would be responsible for going to a cabinet maker to have the case made. Okay, so in Eli Terry's early years, he's fairly conventional, but he starts to experiment with water power, and he starts to experiment with making cheaper and more efficiently produced clocks. And he ends up, his output increases by the late 90s to about 200 clocks per year, which is really high. Okay, so the clock that I've chosen for this entire project comes at the very beginning of Terry's career. In fact, it's been said that this is actually the first clock that Eli Terry ever made himself. I think it was like 22. And normally, because of the separation between case maker and clockmaker, we wouldn't, I wouldn't spend as much time looking at the clock case itself or the entire thing itself. But because of the fact that this case was made by a well-known local maker, I think it's worth spending a little bit of time looking at. But for me personally, I feel that the case itself and the dial, that's the two left images, it represents very well this in-between period in the decline of Rococo elements in things like cabinet making and silverware, silversmith stuff, and the rise of neoclassical movements. So on the, and of course, so on the dial, on the middle image, you see things like scrolls and these florid images. But then on the case, you also see things like Greek influenced columns, which is very much neoclassical. The case isn't really, you couldn't really, I don't think you could say that it's like federal style, but it's kind of exemplary of the turn towards federal style in furniture, especially cabinet making. And then on the right is that's the wooden movement, Terry's wooden movement. And I wish I had a better picture. That's the only picture there is ever. And then the movement on the left is a very similar clock at Yale University Art Gallery. That's a better picture. Okay. Then here's where we get to the really, really important stuff. So basically, Terry starts to improve the clockmaking process, and he moves to Plymouth in 1797. But then he actually builds another factory again in the very early 1800s, and he starts to tinker around even more with more advanced production processes. Then in 1807, two merchants from Waterbury, called Eli and Levi Porter, approach Eli Terry and ask him to make 4,000 clock movements in the space of 3 years. And I don't know why he accepted it, because no one could do that at the time, but he did. And in the first year, his output is 1,000, which is crazy, but it's not on track to, in the first 2 years, his output is 1,000, but it's not on track to fulfill the contract. But in that space of time, he really sets to thinking about how to make clocks in mass. And it's just the clock movements, by the way. So in that new factory, he's hiring new people. In particular, he's hiring, this isn't important, you don't have to know this, but he's hiring people like two joiners, Seth Thomas, and Silas Holden. It will come a little bit later, but you don't have to know that. So the most important thing in clock movements is the parts, the wheels and the pinions and the arbors, these little clock parts. So he starts to make machines, water-powered machines, to do it. And this is a machine, one of the machines that he made. This is actually a gear-cutting milling machine. And this is on loan from the Smithsonian, and it's currently on view at the American Watch and Clock Museum in Bristol, Connecticut. And basically it's a typical wooden frame machine, but there were belt-driven, leather belts that were driven by the drum, and it was all water-powered. And you would have gear cutters in the middle. You actually had three separate gear cutters, one like this, one like this, one like this. And they would drill, the gear cutters would move into these wood blocks and create these parts. And the growth of this machine continues into a lot of other different machinery. And I would love to spend time looking at the development of different machines like this one, and then the Blanchard lathe that is in the Springfield Armory, and Elijah K. Root's machines in Collinsville Axe Company, and like coal manufacturing machines, and then modern day Bridgeport milling machines. But I don't have time for that, so I'm just going to have to go on. Another thing, of course, is he starts to change up the assembly process. So what he does is that on the board, a very skilled artisan worker or journeyman could handle the outside of that board while all those fussy parts on it, right? And a less skilled worker, but they're still, skilled workers, but skilled artisans, would operate the machine to create the parts and place them on the board, I think. So there's starting to be a division in the shop floor. So this is, and so in the third year of the contract, Eli Terry makes 3,000, so he made 1,000 in the first 2 years. Then in the last year, he actually makes 3,000 clocks in 1 year, clock movements in 1 year. And how he did that was everything that I've just said. New machinery, new labor-saving processes, and different production process of assembly. And it's said by many scholars that this is basically the first example of mass manufacturing with interchangeable parts, arguably in the world, but definitely in the United States. It happened in Plymouth, Connecticut, like in Bristol area. Okay. Then we'll just have to, and this completely changes the game. And he actually goes into a brief bit of retirement. And he retires in 1810. And then all of a sudden he comes back in 1814 and completely revolutionizes the clock industry even more. And now he starts to think about a way to make a clock a true fungible commodity that can be sold on the mass market, not just for upper class people, not even just middle class people, but all people. And what he does is he thinks, how can I make the clock more fungible? How can I make it more marketable? How can I make it easier to produce? And this is basically the prototype of what's to come. This is from it says 1816, but the idea was started in 1814. And this is called Eli Terry's box clock. And it's literally just a glass box cabinet with a clock movement in it. But he develops it even further. So this is from 1817, and this is called the outside escapement pillar on the school shell clock. The reason why is because the escapement wheel, that wheel you see on the front, is on the outside. It's actually on the face of the dial. And he patents this, and he continues production. And this really starts to change the game in the clock industry, because now these Yankee peddlers are going all across New England, and they're showing them these clocks that an average person can afford. And then arguably the most important clock, type of clock in American history, is this. This is Eli Terry's basically the apex of his technological development, his idea for an affordable clock. This is the 5-hour or 30-hour wooden movement, inside-outside escapement mechanism, pillar and scroll shelf clock. And it's called inside-outside escapement mechanism, and this time the escapement wheel is on the outside of the board of the clock movement, but it's on the inside of the case. Why that's important, I can't explain to you because I don't have time. But basically, this is now the most affordable, most widely available clock on the market, and it completely revolutionizes the clock industry. At this point, clocks have gone within a space of 30 years or less, arguably less, much less, from a luxury commodity that only the upper classes can afford to something that basically everybody can afford. For the lower classes, not without kind of difficulty of having to, repay the installment to the Yankee peddlers that were coming on. But there's a lot of these clocks still in existence because there were so many of them. In fact, I just saw one two. Okay, and these are just examples of pillar and scroll clocks from the 1830s, because a lot of Eli Terry's apprentices, people who are working for Eli Terry, basically just stole the idea and just made these clocks themselves. And there's actually a lot of scandals about whether or not certain clocks were protected by Eli Terry's patent or not. There's a lot of interesting stories, but I don't have time to go into it. I would love to, but I can't. And basically, what I want to point out in this one is just basically one thing. It's that these clocks start to employ really interesting stencil work. So on the dial, on the one on the left, those flowers, I can't zoom in, but those flowers are done by stencil. So the outline is stenciled in, and then they're finished by hand. And then similarly, on the right, the wood, especially on the top where you can see the fruits and stuff, that's also done by stencil. And the idea comes from actually a woodworker, artisan, and then furniture maker, entrepreneur, Lambert Hitchcock from Riverton, Connecticut, we'll briefly mention. And I really want to talk about what's going on in the pictures on the glass, on the bottom. Those are painted onto the back of the glass. And I would love to talk about those, because as far as I know, no scholar has really dug deep into the imagery on these things. But I don't have time, so go on, maybe if you have questions. Actually, I'm going to stop now and ask if you have any questions so far.
Well, so one thing I would say is that the painting on the clocks is probably an extension of the type of overmantel painting that was popular at the time.
Yeah.
Since these are mantel clocks, instead of having a large painting, you would have that, and it's often a scene that's either taken from a British print, or it can be a landscape or a depiction of your home. So a lot of people have that. One thing that has come to mind as you've been talking about the creation of clocks and the ability to make them at a more affordable price so that more people could have them is it makes me think of the issue of the standardization of time. So that's something that happens, of course, with the railroads specifically, because you had to have timetables because before the standardization of time, each town, each city had a slightly different time. It'd be like 12 o'clock in stores, but then it would be like 12:15 in Hartford, and every town it was it was kind of in flux, which made it very difficult if you're printing timetables for a train, and every town has a different measures time in a slightly different way. But it seems that with the kind of proliferation of clocks, it's kind of this first step towards a standardization of time across you know, across the early United States, even though there's no clear way to sync it in you know, between towns, but that there's at least a more rigid.
Yeah.
And I mean, that goes along with industrialization too,
Yeah,
with the
I was
workday,
gonna
the
say-
factory workday.
Yeah, isn't it beautiful that one of the most important objects, manufactured objects in the story of the rise of capitalism is the clock.
Mm-hmm.
Because with factory production, you have to be regulated by a clock. You're working for a wage based on hours and time. Okay, so there's two, now I'm gonna talk about two kind of ideas. I'm gonna talk about patents and entrepreneurship in Eli Terry. So I've talked about all these inventions and developments in Eli Terry's clockmaking process, but all along the way, he's patenting his inventions. He's going to the federal government and saying, look, I have a new way of making these clocks, and I have new designs for clocks, and so on, so as to protect his enterprise. This is an example, of course, of the federal government, of stately development. Without a federal government to enforce the patents and as well as do a whole bunch of other things like enforce property relations and regulate trade, you couldn't have, Terry's life would be much, much harder. And this is actually a copy of the original patent for the 1816 patent for one of his shell clocks. And it's signed by James Madison. But this entire time, Eli Terry is still an artisan. He is actually, in the 1800s, by 1810s even, he's not extremely well off. He's not extremely well. I mean, in his later life, he becomes well off. He dies and his estate is worth like $53,000 in their time's money, which is really a lot. But for most of the time, he's not very well off. But he's trying to make money by creating enterprises. He creates, there's many different iterations of this, but the early companies are called like Terry and Sons, or Eli Terry and Sons, or Eli Terry and Son. He actually has difficulty, he has to change a bunch of them. But what we're seeing is that someone like Terry, a master craftsman, is really one of the first entrepreneurs. Even though artisans don't have capital, they're not really the people with money, right? Eli Terry couldn't possibly fulfill the border contract if it weren't for the two merchants from Waterbury that could provide capital and resources. So what we're seeing is basically the top bullet, the creation of the first capitalist class. And what happens is the artisan class, the upper stratas of it, master craftsmen in the top tier trades, start to fuse with the people who have capital, which is merchants, and also rich professionals, but mostly mostly that group. And they create a sort of new capitalist class. So someone like Terry, who's an artisan, is an entrepreneur, but he needs the money and capital resources from the merchant, rich professional classes. And then most of the rest of the urban laboring classes, you can say, becomes kind of a new working class. Although the story of how the working class comes to form is a very complicated story, especially in the United States, and it involves the story of immigrants and people coming out of farm families, women, formerly enslaved people, etc. And you also have a substantial kind of middle class because you have a lot of farmers who might own a plot of land. They might, a small amount of real estate. Technically that's like petty bourgeois, you could say. And you also have people like professionals. So there's a long tradition of like a middle class in the United States. But nonetheless, you get this bifurcation between owners of capital and sellers of labor and wage earners. So we just talked a lot about clock making, and I still think that Eli Terry clocks are the most important artisan craft in the story of the transition from pre-modern economy to a capitalist economy, and it's the most important craft in the story of the rise of industrial manufacturing. Even though technically we haven't really even got to the first factories, the Eli Terry factories are still basically just houses of artisans working. But I want you to know that, and I would love to spend time on this, but I can't. There's a lot of other technological developments that are happening in artisan shop floors at this time, especially in the Connecticut River Valley area. And probably the most important reason why is because we're in the aftermath of the American Revolution. There's this unleashing of market relations and market forces, and that's putting pressure on artisans to create more things cheaply and for broader markets. So this is a diagram of a lot of different artisan technological developments in the Connecticut River area. And I want you to look at this for like 20 seconds. So there's a lot of weird and crazy ways in which all of these people are connected to each other. But I don't really have time to talk about that. But basically, I mean, I can try a little.
That's your refrain.
Yeah, yeah, let's start with Nathan Starr. Nathan Starr so that cutlass is from 1808. I couldn't fit the dates in, so I'll just have to say. Nathan Starr cutlass is from 1808, and it's a great example of an artisan going to the federal government, and the federal government grants Nathan Starr a contract to make cutlasses basically for the War of 1812 and through the 1810s and into the 1820s. And of course, federal contracts for arms production, that's still with us very much today in Connecticut, I mean. And Starr Mill is actually a yoga studio now, still there though. And close by, Simeon North is one of the first people to apply the idea of interchangeable parts to rifles. And he's also in communication with Eli Terry, and they're working on a milling machine together, or they're at least communicating. And actually, by the way, there's no way to know for sure, but there's a couple of records that indicate that the Eli Whitney milling machine on the bottom, that the Eli Terry gear cutting milling machine that he's using to make those clock wheels and clock pinions might have been influenced by Eli Whitney's milling machine. There's a passage from one of Eli Terry's sons talking about that they were in communication. Although I think Eli Whitney gets way too much credit for interchangeable parts. It really wasn't him. Eli Terry is probably much more important. Then we talked about the Cheneys, who started to make clocks with wooden movements, which was cheaper and in many cases quicker. And Eli Terry is apprenticed to them. And actually another person who was apprenticed to the Cheneys was John Fitch, who was born basically in the same place as Eli Terry. And he was apprenticed to one of the Cheneys. And he goes on to create one of the first steamships. It's not very successful. And actually Thomas Blanchard in Springfield, Connecticut, who also is responsible for important machinery, he actually makes one of the first practical steamships. And then I mentioned the stenciling, and Lampoy Hitchcock, who is in Riverton, Connecticut, is basically doing the first IKEA in the 19th century. He's making, well, he was actually another thing is he was working with one of the Cheneys who was a woodworker. Anyways, so he's basically finding ways to make chair parts very efficiently that could then be sold to a buyer, and the buyer assembles them on their own. And the Hitchcock sideshare, which from the 1820s, becomes really popular, and that's another, just like the pillar and scroll clock. There's a lot of households in New England that have the lumber Hitchcock's sideshare, and that stenciling is applied to the pillar and scroll clock, as we see. And then Elijah K. Root is working in an axe company in Collinsville, Connecticut, which is Canton, part of it. And he then applies the machinery that he's developing there to Colt. He becomes the head superintendent of Colt. And then Chauncey Jerome, which is one of Eli Terry's apprentices, starts to go back to brass. So brass was really the old style of making clocks, but he finds a way to make brass clocks way less expensive through a process of making, I can't explain it, but a process of making it cheaper, basically. And by this time, now the shelf clock can hit the world market because you can transport it. Because before, wooden movements, you can't put that overseas. Just like we talked about paintings, it's very hard to put it overseas because they expand and contract with humidity and stuff like that. But with the brass ones, you can export it, and they were exporting those in droves. I mean, Chauncey Jerome, a student, an apprentice of Eli Terry, is literally making, by the 1870s, 200,000 clock movements a year, which is crazy. Okay, so now I'm going to take 10 more minutes, which is plenty of time for me to do this. And I want to talk about how this stuff gets applied. So let's go back for a second. So there's all of these artisan developments, but for the most part, they're still in the very, very early factories, which are houses of artisans. But these are some of the examples of how that gets applied to really the first industrial endeavors. But first, I want to start with questions. Anyone have a question? This is really start with water. No questions? Cool. Yeah, so on the top left is Springfield Armory in Springfield, Massachusetts. So in the 1790s, the federal government, which is the first federal government, George Washington, they set up a federal armory, which is basically a place where guns are made and stored, in Springfield, Connecticut. The reason being that it's upriver enough to be protected from attack, but it's also on a great river, the Connecticut River. And initially, it's just a house of artisans making guns. But the federal government explicitly seeks to make guns interchangeable. And they explicitly seek out to use the type of manufacturing process that someone like Terry is employing in clock making, standardized interchangeable parts. And you can think, with interchangeable parts in guns, it's especially important because on the battlefield, it's very practical to have interchangeable parts. You're basically picking up unused guns and having to use them. And they improve a lot of the machinery. So on the middle bottom, that's actually what's called a Blanchard lathe. And if you see it, if you look at it, it's basically using the same kind of grammar as the Eli Terry gear cutting machine. I think it might be worth going over it back just to see that. Yeah, this one. It's like the same. Wait, let me let you actually look at it. This one. Right, and so it's a whole combination, and also you're getting a much deeper division of labor. The bottom left is Robinson Lawrence Company in Windsor, Vermont. Believe it or not, Windsor, Vermont was a center of industry in the United States. Today, Robinson Lawrence is actually a precision manufacturing museum. And then on the top right, that's Chicopee, Massachusetts. We have Ames and Company Firearms. And they're employing interchangeability as well. They're employing the milling machine as well. And division of labor. And then really the big company that takes all of the past history of artisan technology and raises it to a kind of apex in industrial manufacturing is Colt Firearms in Hartford, Connecticut. And in Colt Firearms, you get to the point where it's, for all intents and purposes, Fordism. You get assembly line style production, fully interchangeable parts, mass manufacturing in highly capital intensive machinery. And a lot of the ideas are coming directly out of artisan technological developments from earlier decades. As I mentioned earlier, Elijah K. Ruber is the superintendent of Colt's factory. He was an artisan axe maker himself in Collinsville. And he then applied that to Colt. I'd love to talk more about this stuff, but I don't have time. Okay, so then, by the time we get to the turn of the 20th century, or the beginning of the 20th century, the end of the 19th, Hartford and Springfield are literally the two most important cities for industrial manufacturing in the United States, arguably in the entire world. So all of the technology that's used to make things like guns gets applied to what we see on the bottom left, which is Columbia bicycles, which then turns into the first cars, Columbia automobile, and it's really a quirk of history, or fortuitous. These are terms that historians should be using. But it's a quirk of history, really, that Hartford or Springfield and not Detroit, or that Detroit and not Hartford or Springfield becomes the center of the car industry, the automobile industry. You also get motorcycles. This is Indian motorcycle plant in Springfield. Motorcycles start in Germany, but I don't know if you know this, the first marketable motorcycles basically start in Middletown, and they set up shop in Springfield, Massachusetts. The bottom right is actually the Duryea Brothers electric car, the first electric car tested in the world in the late 1890s in Springfield, Connecticut. And then Hamilton Sunstrand, or Hamilton Standard for propellers in Windsor Locks. And then just above that is wheat sewing machine factory in Hartford, Connecticut, huge factory. It actually becomes much bigger than the picture there. And then on the very middle bottom, that's actually Pratt & Whitney, which grows out of Colt in making precision machinery. So now we have something that definitely looks like capitalism, you know. Oh, and then on the top right, that's the first plane, some of the first planes, Granville Brothers in Springfield. And then below that, I've included, that's actually Mass Mutual, because I just want to let you know, even if I don't have time to talk about it, that you can't have production without finance and organizations of overseeing the circulation of capital and, you know, stuff like insurance. Okay. And then you can see that our economy today in Connecticut is very much a product of all this history. Pratt & Whitney comes out of Colt. We have insurance like Travelers, the Hartford, Mass Mutual, and you have all of these very capital-intensive engineering companies like United Technologies, Sikorsky, ING. Well, it's headquartered, will become way out of it, headquartered in Windsor, and EB, of course, in New London, making submarines. Okay, so now I'm on the last 2 minutes of my presentation, 2 minutes or so, and I just want you to think about what is happening to society, to the environment, and really everything in this process. This is what Springfield looks like in 1819. This is what Springfield looks like in the 1840s. This is actually on view at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. I think it's still up there. And this is what Springfield looks like at the beginning of the 20th century, when Springfield and Hartford are basically the most important industrial manufacturing centers. And I also want you to think about today, because if you go to Springfield today, you'll see a lot of abandoned factories like this. Same thing with Hartford. Yeah, this is a photo that I took of my really bad that's like, it's like in the middle of like Frog Hollow neighborhood in Parkland. And I think it's important to because all of this history, starting with the transition, starting with craft production and going into how the first factories were built and how industry developed, and then understanding that to a large extent, Hartford is no longer the center of industry. These things have a lot of bearing on our understanding of stuff like urban blight and things like poverty in Connecticut, because Connecticut is a really terrible place to be if you're an unskilled worker. And I'm planning on giving a version of this talk to an organization of industrial machinists. And one of the things that I want them to know is that they're still very much a part of this history. Like, there's a long history of skilled machinists. Eli Terry was basically a skilled machinist. Eli Whitney, well, pretend I didn't say that. Yeah, Elijah Root is basically started off, at least, as a skilled machinist. At first he was unskilled. He was actually a child laborer in a silk mill. But all of these artisans are basically, I mean, it's kind of an anachronism, but they're basically skilled workers. And today, I have a lot of friends that are like, welders and machinists. And Connecticut's it's a pretty good place to be if you're a skilled worker at EB, but it's a pretty terrible place to be if you're unskilled. I'm gonna have to find a way to like make that more potent, but I'll find a way. Okay, so now we're at the end of the presentation, and I've taken you from the Eli Terry tall case clock, which you can see for yourself in Wadsworth Atheneum on the second floor of the aviary room, in which interchangeable parts, mass manufacturing, was definitely, I would argue, an idea in Terry's head. I think we have enough information and sources to say that it was an idea in Terry's head. And that the story about how Terry came to realize mass manufacturing, and then the proliferation of artisan technologies in New England, the Connecticut River Valley in particular, leads to the emergence of the first industrial manufacturing in the US and even in the world. By the late 19th century, I mean, this is arguable, but in some ways, the US is more advanced than Britain in industrial manufacturing. To today, where we have an economy that's, in Connecticut, that's based very heavily on things like war production, the aerospace industry. So we go from Terry tall clock to engine turbines. And that's it.
Thank you, Ryan.